The search for the best Nintendo Switch wired controller continues, and today, instead of doing an in-depth on one new one, we're going to go over a whole bunch of options at once. Starting with a quick recap on the two we've already covered from Hori and PowerA. Now, for the Hori one, big downsides going on is the fact that it's definitely not one of the prettiest Pro Controller options, plus it's hardwired in, there's no way to remove this cable right here, but on the upside it has surprisingly good buttons and sticks considering its cheap price, and while it doesn't have a traditional D-pad, it does give you the ability to switch between a D-pad interface or just using buttons, which honestly I actually really like. On the other hand, you have the PowerA controller. Definitely a better looking design and more comfortable grip. I'm not as big of a fan though of the sticks, the buttons feel a little worse, and the D-pad is a downgrade, but still usable. Overall still a solid choice, and detachable cable is really nice. But with those out of the way, let's start talking about some new choices. First, we're going to take a look at probably the most traditional controller option, and that's the new Core controller from Nyko. Now, at first glance, honestly, this thing kind of seems like a mixture of the major downsides of both the Hori and the PowerA. You're getting this hardwired-in controller. I really don't like the triggers because there's this kind of soft design instead of being just an actual trigger pull or a straight-up button. It's got a D-pad similar to PowerA's, which is usable, but not great. Buttons are okay, but it does have a turbo button like the Hori, which is a nice upside. The interesting thing about this though is the fact that while Nyko lists this as being $30, which is the same as the other two, you can actually grab this at a lot of places for only $20. Now, like I said, it is worse than the other two, but honestly, when we're talking about third-party cheap controller options, the margins are actually pretty tiny. So getting this for $10 less is honestly actually a pretty tempting offer. Next up, we're gonna get a little weirder, and we're gonna talk about the Pokken controller for the Switch. Now, this is actually just a new version of the same controller they made for the Wii U. If you still own the Wii U ones, that'll work on your Switch as well. And before we talk about the benefits of this thing, it does have some pretty obvious downsides of the fact that you are missing a lot of inputs here. There are no analog sticks whatsoever. The ZL and ZR buttons have been moved from the shoulders to being on buttons right here. Very clearly, this controller was designed specifically for Pokken in mind. So in Pokken, it's great. Other games, not so much, because clearly you're missing a lot of inputs you need. Where it gets interesting though is where you consider using it in games that don't actually need all these buttons. Things like Mario Kart, Shovel Knight, games that are designed to work on the Joy-Con directly. This is actually a really solid option as well, especially if you like using D-pad. This is actually one of the better D-pad designs of all the different wired controllers, and the grip, despite looking a little weird at first glance, is actually really comfortable and grows on you really fast. If you're looking for one wired controller that's gonna work across all your games, this isn't the answer. But if you like playing a lot of simpler stuff, something you can do multiplayer in, this is actually a really good choice. Now for something really unconventional, a little more different from the rest on this list, because it's not a third-party controller option you can grab, but instead, it's using your GameCube controller on the Switch. Now, as of the end of October, when the Switch launched its 4.0 patch, a lot of people realized that you can use this Wii U GameCube adapter on the Switch to use your controllers, which is actually really cool. It does have some downsides worth noting. First off, the fact that, like the Pokken controller, you are missing some buttons. So depending on the game, it might not be all that usable. In particular, you're missing a minus button because the start button right here only works like a plus button, and you only have a ZR button, you do not have a ZL. So depending on the game, this could work either great or terrible. Another way it can be a little awkward too is the fact that all the buttons are just a one-to-one comparison. So if it's an A button move, it goes to this A button. If it's Y, it goes to this. The problem is that since the button layout is so different compared to the Pro controller, some games weren't really designed for this layout in mind, and it's gonna be really awkward. But if you're like me and you really loved using the GameCube controller, you can take the time to learn to use the thing, and honestly, it works out really great. The big problem, however, is that these aren't super easy to come by anymore. So until Nintendo potentially starts making new ones to go for the Switch specifically, it's gonna be a real hassle to hunt these down. So at the end of the day, what is the best traditional controller option for the Switch? Well, first off, it needs to be said, the actual Pro controller is going to be your best choice. It's wireless, you've got the NFC reader, motion controls, all that good stuff. But if you're looking to save money and you wanna grab one of these instead, there's arguments that can be made for each one. You know, if you want to save as much money as possible, the Nyko for going only $20 is actually a good option. However, I do think it's worth spending a little more to go for the Hori or the PowerA for different reasons. The Hori is a little more unconventional, the shape is different, the D-pad is a little weird for those of you that, try it out for the first time, but honestly, if you give it a shot, I really like this controller. If, on the other hand, you want something that's a lot closer to Nintendo's Pro controller, the PowerA is going to be a solid choice. I still have a couple hang-ups about it, but it's a lot closer in design, it's got a really comfortable grip, both are going to be solid options for your Switch.